Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Reagan Mellinson, and I'm working with the Columbia Basin Watershed Network on the communications program. The Columbia Basin Watershed Network Society is the go-to hub for watershed groups to find training, information, or connections. We are a voice for watershed stewardship across the basin. Today, you guys are all registered for the third of our four-part series. And we want to give a big thanks to the Columbia Basin Trust for sponsoring this series, along with the Columbia Basin Watershed Network. We just want to talk about our fourth webinar that was planned for this series, Understanding Basin Water Resources, with Martin Carver, has been postponed and will be rescheduled. So we'll let you know when we have a new date for that webinar. So it's 1:30 now, so we'll get going. I will be administering this webinar. If you have any tech questions or issues, please send me a message on the chat and I'll do my best to address them. You can find the chat in your GoToWebinar. It's a pull-down menu to the right. And then also, if you lose your connection or are removed from the webinar for any reason, click the link that was provided when you registered and it should plug you back into the session. So thank you in advance for your patience with all this technology stuff. All participants, you'll notice, have been placed on a blanket mute, and this is to avoid background noise and feedback as there are many registrants for this session. So again, if you have a question or you want to chat in the box, feel free to do that. If you have any questions during the webinar, please use the question function. The webinar will look like Tara will start us out, and then she'll present for about 20 minutes and then break for questions. And at this point, we can unmute, or I'll just be answering the questions and typing them out to Tara. And then after Tara's presentation and her question period, Gerry will speak after that for about 40 minutes, and then there will again be time for questions after his presentation. So I just want to introduce our speakers. So Tara Lynn Clapp, PhD, is the Senior Manager and Coordinator of the Columbia Basin Watershed Network and Natural Resource Policy Fellow with the Rural Policy Learning Commons. As well as her work with the Columbia Basin Watershed Network, she teaches graduate natural resources, planning, and policy. She's a planner by training and works with nonprofits to build capacity. And then our second speaker today, Gerry Nellestijn, comes to the watershed world via long experience in the world of people programs. Gerry has brought his experience with relationship and partnership building, programming, funding, and planning into the natural resource conservation world. He builds partnerships for the Salmo River watershed and mentors other member groups of the Columbia Basin Watershed Network in stream keepers. So we'll get started with our presentations now.
Thanks very much, Reagan. I'm just making sure that I'm sharing the right screen here. And yes, we'll be having questions, and hopefully Reagan will just read the questions, or if she needs clarification, she can like let someone else like unmute you if you've asked a question. Anyway, so today I want to introduce this broad theme of sustainable funding for watershed health. My outline today, I want to talk a little bit about how we came to start organizing some work and some sessions on this issue, talk about what sustainable funding for watershed stewardship might be, what is the money for, and then talk a little bit, like briefly, about economics, and then just ways to create markets in watershed values so that there's more opportunity. Watersheds, the main idea here is we get such value from watersheds: drinking water, health, human health and safety. Our property values are tied to our watershed health. And right now we don't have a lot of ways to express that value as citizens or watershed residents. And so just talk about what people are experimenting in terms of creating markets on the, in this sort of a open framework sort of setting. And then Gerry's going to give a case study of one way to approach that in Salmo, and we have a whole program of people that are working on this general set of issues for the spring, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So the Watershed Network member groups are nonprofit groups that are involved in watershed stewardship in the Canadian Columbia Basin. So our member groups have a focus on ecological things, aquatic health, and some also are drinking water providers. So sustainable funding has been an issue for Watershed Network members, groups and individuals for a long time. It's clearly identified as a priority where members needed support through our fall 2016 workshops. And right now we have a member group survey out in members and member groups, same survey, but we're really trying to ask some questions of our member groups to get a good sense of how member groups are putting together resources for their activities right now. And we have a sense of what that looks like, but we wanted to be able to reflect a better picture of that back to our members. So I'm having a little trouble. There. So a lot of our members are grant-funded organizations, and many are, they run this sort of the spectrum from volunteer only to single grant to multiple grants. And there's a lot of sort of issues and pitfalls about being grant-funded given our current set of granting resources. So one major one is that the priorities of granting organizations may not be the same as local priorities. Grantors seldom fund projects of more than about a year in length, and there's fairly high demand for that grant funding and high levels of competition, and it can harm the ability of groups to collaborate with each other when they're collaborating for resources. And then from a granting perspective, grantors may seek to distribute funds over a region more than reach performance goals. And increasingly, groups are finding that they need more than one grant at a time, that they have to have some kind of source of matching funds or resources. So that's some of the issues with just being grant funded. So in terms of addressing this issue, I'm sorry, my cat is crackling paper. This is one of the problems with webinars, is the cat problem. Sorry. So this webinar is an introduction to various frameworks of value how we should be attracting funds to watershed stewardship, and then the effort of how Salmo has tried to put some of those values into motion, and then their story about what works and what is problematic. In April, we're hosting Todd Reeve from the Bonneville Environment Foundation, and watch our e-blasts for news about that. He's doing a lot of really innovative work on how to attract private and corporate investment into rural watersheds, and what are his experiences and what are some of the challenges of doing that. At our spring meeting, and we're looking at either the end of April or the end of May, we're bringing a set of, I'm really quite excited about it, sustainable funding for watershed stewardship, some examples. How are people partnering with local governments on assets and services? What's people's experience about building partnerships for local watershed stewardship? And we'll be able to report on the results from the member survey about how our members are doing. And then at the fall meeting, we want to continue this theme, because there's lots of work to do in terms of getting the kinds of results that we want in watershed stewardship. Really is what it's about. So on to that, what is sustainable funding? So I like how Bonneville Environment Foundation just comes right out and says that sustainable funding is where you get the watershed restored. So more broadly, it would support watershed stewardship over a time frame that allows you to get what you want done. And it would be support at a level that reflects the value and contributions of watersheds to quality of life, human health and safety, and property value and the environment. And in the Canadian Columbia Basin, which is where I am and where our member groups are, it's hard for us to attract those big dollars out to our region because we have a kind of a low base population in a very large area. There's lots of watershed area. It's incredibly beautiful area, and those of us who live here love to live here. But we don't have a lot of population base to draw on in terms of specialized values. So we have to there is some requirement for us to get along, which I was going to say, which is hard. There can be intergroup competition in that kind of a limited resource environment, and that it's sometimes hard for groups to collaborate with each other, even on. And I mentioned that with the grant environment. Sometimes we have very strongly held interests that we're very passionate about, and it's kind of hard sometimes for us to make partnerships with people that don't share all our values and our commitments. And then we have this sort of grant funding thing where also we would like to be building relationships with large grantors, and they can be kind of intermittent or unpredictable, and we can't count on that as a source of sustainable funding because we're not setting their goals essentially. So what do we actually need? Well, and I'm thinking here like an economist. I'm going to think of like an economist, so that I'm going to think like not about who does it, but what do we need? So we need money for watershed assessment, and that's social and physical, biophysical. So we need to identify values, including geology, hydrology, and cultural values. We need to be able to see if there's any conflicts between those values or uses, and that takes some involvement and some more mapping. Then we need to do some technical and scientific research. What are the ways that we could mitigate these risks? How can we make sure people are safe and healthy, and how can we protect our water? And at that point, once you have that at least enough information to go forward on, how do we set priorities, gain agreement? We want to invest in restoration, source protection, how to mitigate conflicts. And then if we need to fund some watershed reserves, how do we do that? So we have experience with all of this across the province and the West. But I want to talk again about this kind of the economics problem in British Columbia. And I want to put it in economics term, public good. So public good, if you think of like a city park, one person can go in and tend the flowers and work hard and do a little maintenance and take care of a tree. And another person can go in and throw garbage around and play loud music and not pick up after their dog. And both of those individuals, they've paid the same, but their costs are different. So, in a public good, it's really hard to, without some further social investment, you can't give a ticket or an award or, you have to invest something into the regulatory world to manage a public good. And so I think that for a lot of the province, the watersheds are mostly in Crown land, which is publicly owned. So we have a situation where the public sort of, if you think about it, average cost to the public purse of the cost of stewardship, you have some kind of the province is then paying some marginal cost against the resource revenues. Like if they invest in stewardship, it's going to, either through regulation or through investments, it's going to cost them something that they would otherwise have in resource income. And then what benefit will the public get? Well, they're going to avoid some costs. Human health and safety is a cost avoided. But most of the benefits are not going to be like directly attributable to watershed stewardship. So for the province, it's not going to appear big on a balance sheet. For the resource sector, the costs of stewardship are high. If they have to avoid an area, build higher roads, hire more professionals, do more consultations, those are all direct balance sheet costs. And the benefits, you know, they might not be low, but they're kind of past the shareholder horizon, or they're not, you know, they're not immediately obvious. So there's if you just think about that setup alone, the economic forces are working against watershed stewardship in that who pays who benefits situation. Community watershed, right now, it's really hard for community watersheds, for example, to actually do things with stewardship, so they can be excluded from doing things for stewardship. So it's a low cost, and their benefits from good stewardship practices are very high. Human health and safety. So you can say, well, we're avoiding, you know, we're avoiding landslides, and we're drinking good water. Those are high benefits. And then from a local government, again, they can be kind of excluded from the costs of stewardship. But the benefit of having someone do stewardship is very high in terms of tax base, very high in terms of revenues. And again, that's a kind of an avoided cost thing. If you have a whole piece of, like, for example, Johnson's Landing, basically, you know, there's a slide there. I'm not sure that that could have been avoided with good stewardship, but it's an example where, you know, a town is lost, lives are lost, property value is erased. That's not, you know, from a local government, just from a balance sheet perspective, that's not good. So then you look at it again from an economist. Are we getting enough investment in watershed stewardship? Well, basically, the main message is that we kind of lack ways to choose to protect watersheds in this sort of conventional market mechanisms. And so one way of looking at this problem is to say, how do we create those markets? So how do we facilitate so that people can actually get the levels of watershed stewardship that they want? Again, I'm thinking of economics really broadly, right? So for example, what are some strategies that we've used for this in the past? Well, donations. We can solicit donations to fund protection and conservation. And this is long discussed in the environmental protection literature, that this works best for big kind of charismatic environments. Our species, you know, we talk about charismatic megafauna, or so that you, when you're trying to market donations for something, for someone to protect it that's far away, you want it to be kind of beautiful. But anyway, it is setting up a market for people to put some funds towards something that where they share a value. So I was trying to work out this, you know, what are the value, how broadly is this shared? Because remember, we're working with a kind of a low population center here, and maybe some things we can work out to reach out to the urban centers, but really how broadly do we have to share a value to organize regional stewardship dollars? So if it's protection, aesthetic, and spiritual kinds of values, I put environmentalists with this sort of a quotation. There's really a lot of people who have protective, aesthetic, spiritual values, but it's not a very large, you know, it's kind of a predictable proportion of the population. So you can create a donation opportunity so that you can share, you can allow someone to share in your advocacy for this environment. And then sort of mechanistically, you know, foundations can do this and give grants, or people can volunteer to a certain extent to help protect, to help work for this. For water quality or aquatic health, who cares about that? Well, people who drink, like water, fisher folk, scientists, people with a scientific interest. And so there's kind of a, if you like, a market for that value that the Watershed Network is really good at. Volunteer opportunity, to a certain extent donations, and engaging people in the community in these values. But basically the mechanism for how you bring funds to that has been through grants and through, well, funds or resources, grants or volunteer opportunities. drinking water is our other major group. And we think about it, we haven't thought about that as much for watershed stewardship. We thought about it, well, I shouldn't say, I meant we, the Watershed Network. So water users certainly share this value, and also those who protect drinking water share this value. So how do we protect source water, and what kinds of watershed stewardship protects drinking water? So there's some kind of market for this value. If you think about what you're selling lower treatment cost, water quality, and property value. You could assemble those values among a group of water users, and through taxes, fees, contracts, or service grants, kind of bring that money to watershed stewardship. So fish and wildlife, there's a certain amount of this organized through the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program, which is provincial regulation, but there's also ways to set it up in other jurisdictions through license tags, user fees, and basically you get that money back to the groups through fish and wildlife oriented grants. Safety from flood and fire is something that watershed interests share with local governments. And there you're looking at, we also share that value with provincial governments, I think, and insurers, and we can sort of collect that through a tax or toll, or we could do it voluntarily, to protect some values, reach some outcomes. And there's some nice examples of that kind of partnering work in the Elk Valley. And then again, through recreational use, there's some models about how you can, there's some value for tourism promotion that's collected through a shared accommodators toll. There's also examples of where ecotourism providers can voluntarily collect money for guests for protecting the resource. And that's something that we haven't really done with ecotourism and chambers of commerce in British Columbia. To my knowledge, I don't think we're doing that. So what's actually happening? We have, there are good examples across the United States where utilities are paying for some kind of watershed best practices in forestry, grazing, or agriculture in upstream watersheds to lower costs in drinking water. Also water treatment and flood control, but those tend to be larger centers where that kind of scale of funds actually funds best practices, but I think that's a concept that we could explore at a sort of a different scale. There's partnering with local governments, and there's examples of where local governments are looking at how to do green infrastructure instead of gray infrastructure. So that means how do we invest in forest riparian areas and wetlands instead of investing in concrete infrastructure. And so sometimes that's called ecosystem services, sometimes it's called eco-asset. Eco-asset is more about how you maintain your natural capital in producing some level of income. And again, that's a way of thinking about the real value that we get from watersheds. So right now in British Columbia, there's, I think, Gibson's, I think Silverton, and I think possibly Comox are organizing around the eco-asset concept and looking at asset management. And that one is really, those three are all related. They're really all to do with how to fund municipal infrastructure in ways that are less costly often and have a greater set of benefits. And then there's a certain number of stewardship groups that organize voluntarily payments for ecosystem services programs. So that's where you just go out and you say, we want to provide this ecosystem service, will you help us pay for it? And sometimes that would be the kind of example that Todd Reeve is going to be talking about, and sometimes it can be just donors that value drinking water, flood protection, those kinds of things. You have a wider set of values. And then, as I mentioned, private corporations are partnering with foundations to purchase things that are like, I put water offsets. They're called water restoration certificates to protect and restore watersheds. Now, I was going to spend a little time going through each of those kind of concepts, but I think I won't. And those, I mean, I can share this presentation with you later, or we can come back to those concepts and you can ask me more about who's doing what, as far as I know. But those are the concepts where I'm trying to bring in some speakers and some stories and some resources to the Watershed Network over the next, year. So I wanted to stop there, and I'm going to change the presenter over to, oh no, we're going to have some questions, aren't we, for a few minutes. So Reagan, why don't you just go ahead and, are there any questions before I do that? Have you got your microphone muted?
Hi, Tara.
Hi.
I can't see the questions, it looks like, unless there aren't any questions, unfortunately.
I'll just check. Oh, you're right. There's no real specific questions. I must have been rolling through that stuff at quite a speed. So I'm going to go ahead and let Gerry tell his story about innovative local partnering. I'm going to make him the presenter. And then if you guys want to ask me questions about what I've done there at the end, we can come back around to that.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
And can you see my screen?
Well, your screen, yes, but you still have yes, you're going to start the slideshow?
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit. It just
disappeared. I'm sorry, it just disappeared again, Gerry. It does that disappearing trick. Your screen.
All right, do we have something there now?
There, perfect.
All right, wonderful.
Thank you.
So I want to talk a little bit about myself, and I want to talk a little bit about where we're going with this. My name is Gerry Nellestijn. I coordinate the Salmo Watershed Streamkeepers Society. My academic upbringing is in cultural anthropology, and my postgraduate upbringing is in environmental management. When I came to this area, first in 1985, I began to do some severe career changing and became a fish technologist. So I am one of these lucky guys that's had the ability to pretty much put my head into many of the rivers and streams in the upper basin here in the Canadian Columbia, and also to some degree in the US Columbia as well. So my insights are based on experience and I guess in my academic background. I am a fish technologist. I lament that basically what I've been doing throughout my career is documenting decline. As a watershed steward, the Salmo Watershed Streamkeepers Society are working desperately to promote a partnering approach to aquatic ecosystem health. And I'm going to go through that as a bit of a case study. So my presentation outline is a little bit about stewardship, why we need to take a broad strokes of approach and what we can do to fund it, and a series of conclusions on how we see it. And I hope it'll prompt some questions from folks out there. I don't know why this delay is happening. So I want to talk about stewardship. The basic definition I have for it is taking care of something that you don't own. And it implies taking responsibility for a place or a thing in your area, a watershed, a stream, or even a specific species. It's action-oriented, largely voluntary, but not exclusively. It has value, and I think that that's what we need to be able to translate to groups out there everywhere, is that stewardship actually has value. There's a number of them that we can actually apply metrics to and determine cash values, but that has been a task that's been overlooked here recently, apart from the taking care part. And you know what, it's also participatory. It really means getting wet and getting dirty. It also means advocating, and I'm going to say the word advocating a number of times during this presentation because to some degree, somehow, stewardship groups out there have allowed the word advocacy to kind of shine as a bit of a dirty word. And really, it's a visionary word and something that can lead us well into the future. So it's an ongoing commitment. And you know, when I started this, it became obvious that it becomes part of us. And it's about relationships with others, but it's also very much about a relationship with building a sense of place. And I want to really encourage that relationship building, that we begin to recognize the beauty of the place that we live and the value of the place that we live and inherent kinds of qualitative inputs in place in terms of the basics around environmentalism, which are clean air, clean water, and clean soil. And sometimes it means learning about and building a relationship, in quotations, with specific species. And it's certainly about growing. Making stewardship grow is a task with many approaches, whether or not it's related to monitoring activities or education and outreach or the research piece, and certainly the more increasingly important piece of restoration. It also means having fun. You know, it's kind of neat getting out there with a bunch of people that love place, love species, and love the outdoors, and go out there and do something that's cool and fun. But primarily, and I think we need to increase this element here, it is cultural. It is something that we need to grow in terms of how we value it, how we admire it, and what kind of ethics, principles, and values we surround stewardship with. It's something that we really can't stick our head in the ground about, and it's something that we need to talk about in terms of who should be involved, because basically our approach around here is to encourage partnering. So everyone has a part to play. It's incremental. I always find that environmental challenges are incremental. Some people are willing to accept the option to go out and do some recycling. Others are willing to accept the option to really not get there, you know, not create that garbage in the first place or whatever along that line. Don't contribute to pollution however you can. Grow your own food, grow your own livestock, that kind of thing. And, you know, it's about all of us, every one of us individuals from all areas in the basin and beyond, and it's from all of our social sectors, and it's about all of our geographical areas that should be involved, whether it's highland country, watershed-based kind of approaches, lowland riparian area approaches, they need to look at a consistent and holistic approach. And really, it's about sharing and about understanding different perspectives. And we're going to get into talking a little bit about that further on in this webinar when I talk to you about our watershed planning team approach. That's what will promote successful stewardship. And again, it's cultural. We need to build in an admiration system into our culture that says stewardship is valuable. It's something that gratifies all of us. So, and I often, as a cultural anthropologist, had recalled dreaming during my university days about who would be the most garnered or admired culture. If there was someone out there looking from afar objectively at our cultural makeup across the planet, who would be that culture that would be most admired? And I often thought that it would be a First Nations approach that took a long-term approach to sustainable thinking, a long-term approach to families and nature and admiration of inanimate as well as animate objects and lifestyles within their group culture. So I think it's worthwhile taking a look at the First Nations insight and that has actively internalized stewardship. You know, businesses and corporations are part of our communities, as are local and regional and provincial governments, federal governments, and cross-border governments, and certainly in our watershed. And I think we need to impress upon them that they have to be stewards as well, and they can be. There's usually some element that we can pick out of the mandate of either one of these groups to thin edge of the wedge concepts around stewardship, ethics, principles, and values, and to actually be able to encourage them to come together to work with others. So the other thing about it is we have to look for and encourage people who want to be active. Active is, I think, the operative word around stewardship. It's certainly almost the entertainment element that exists around stewardship, something that looks like getting wet and dirty, as I mentioned earlier. And anyone who shares your value structure and the direction of your stewardship initiative should be included. The other thing that I need to really emphasize here is that we have to set goals and objectives. In our case, it's certainly around legal incorporating, the Constitution and bylaws that guide us and that I constantly refer to if there is some sort of a question that comes to the forefront around what we're doing in our stewardship initiatives. I look back to our Constitution and bylaws, and they guide us. But some general guidelines should be that we consider basing our activities on initiatives that are already recognized by the community, something that looks like a land use plan or a transition strategy in terms of economics, or a strategic approach that calls into order something that looks like it's sustainable. And if this doesn't work, take time and effort around community to build that. And why? Because environmental concerns are social justice concerns. And I think that's a missing piece that we often do not recognize in our efforts, that what we do as environmental stewards actually makes a better place for us all to live in, makes us healthier. And, you know, when we start to get involved in this, we oftentimes drift toward that it's just not about sapient justice, either that species and place have some sort of mix in there that makes our lives better. We use what we call an ecosystem-based partnering approach that tries to balance community, environment, and economy. And it wasn't that long ago that these initiatives or concerns were separated and oftentimes in conflict with each other. And I think that's what's happening now as the drift of our culture begins to recognize a more balanced approach. We are starting to drift toward more environmental integration into our community, and we have to help that. That's part of what stewardship groups do. They need to be on top of new thinking to project to their community. Ecosystem. I like the word ecosystem. For us, it is both a management perspective that does balance community, environment, and economy. Those restricted silo approaches balances them. And in terms of the way we think here anyway, ecosystems are watersheds. Probably the easiest scale for us to manage in terms of getting our head wrapped around what we can do in terms of place-based restoration. So why? Why build a culture that realizes that environmental sustainability is the single most important economic endgame for all? And I think it's about just that. Without environmental health and sustainability, we are not going to have important economic initiatives that happen in the place where we live. And I love this cartoon because it tells us that we can overcome these stock market crashes, but in terms of environmental crash, pretty difficult. So how? Build on strong foundations. And I talked a little bit about community-based initiatives that are already in place. Certainly we did that in terms of building our organization around an economic transition strategy as we left this limited resource extraction community into a broader-based economic approach. And not only that, when we built our planning mechanism that I'm going to go through here in a moment, we based it on provincial guidelines. And when we upgraded our planning mechanism to become our Salmo Pondere Watershed Aquatic Ecosystem Health Improvement Plan, or SWAP as we call it, we integrated the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Action Plans and Species Plans into that, so that we actually termed this thing our marriage proposal. We took both of the thinking that we had described previously in our fish sustainability plan and married it to the FWC action plans. Very, very excellent way to align and share goals. Why? Why partner? The idea definitely is a catalyst for action. It is something that gives us momentum. It allows us to build this joint work plan, and it allows us to start talking about implementation teams. You know, we went through years of planning here in terms of the outlay, the outlay necessary to build trust between groups that were often in conflict with each other. And over that trust building time, what we became very familiar with and still suffer from is that people are a little reluctant to get into involving themselves into planning, especially if there is no guaranteed implementation strategy. And that's the thing that I hope that the groups in the Upper Columbia and elsewhere can advocate for, can move toward, is building a format for a guaranteed implementation strategy based on well thought out and collaborative based planning mechanisms. So you see the little gear wheels there in the slide, talks about funders and regulators, and the operational implementers. Those are the folks that are actually going to kickstart that plan and get wet and dirty and start doing stuff. That can be us as stewards, it can be a consulting group, it can be government, or others that want to take any specific initiative that they can recognize in the plan that is of value to them and operate it, implement it, start to improve place. So SWAP, it's a watershed plan, and it's about long-term effective ecosystem health restoration. I'm sure it's clear to everyone out there that's listening that, and some of us have, focuses on monitoring or outreach and education, and certainly there are the researchers in the group too. But I know as a fisheries technologist that what's happening here is we need restoration. This place looks nothing like it was before we began to impact it. And that's a harsh story, but it's a story that has to be told. We have dramatically altered place. We have dramatically decreased house and home of all sorts of flora and fauna. And we have dramatically decreased the ability for flora and fauna that still exist to actually feed themselves. And those are the basis of restoration: food and home. So the SWAP looks at a range of parties, basically building a watershed planning team with an interest in improving ecosystem health, and a team that can work together effectively. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that happens when we look at some of the challenges a little further on in this webinar. But basically build on mutual respect and the capacity of a diverse set of organizations to take off their own particular operational hat and walk into a watershed-based planning team meeting and look at putting on an aquatic ecosystem health hat. In our case, this is a picture of a diverse group of people. You'll probably, some of us will recognize some of these folks, but it's around, allowing the watershed planning team and asking the watershed planning team for their direction on how to develop a plan and their participation in implementing that plan. Participation, that's the big one. I can't believe how many times we plan and we don't talk about participation of implementation and how we can collapse the respect within that team to work together to actually implement a plan. That's the big hole. Every one of us have probably been involved in the planning mechanism. The implementation piece is not there. So, goal, simple: improve aquatic ecosystem health or ecosystem health. Guiding approaches may be that we encourage or recommend or look to an indicator species. Here on the encouragement of the watershed planning team, they suggested that we use bull trout and rainbow trout as indicator species to actually see if we're making a difference out there. And that's how we guide our investments in the development of our aquatic ecosystem health plan. It's also about conservation and certainly, again, restoration. And it requires some kind of a monitoring metric. The overall approach is definitely to collaborate and definitely to look at strategies to exclude further decline, and in our case, promote enhancement of bull trout and rainbow trout populations. And these things are completely transferable. Each one of you groups may have an indicator that would be more appropriate to whatever your needs are. But we should be looking for some sort of mechanism that leads us to naturally self-sustaining involvement. So that's me up there on that typewriter. That's about how good I can actually type. But, you know, it's going to require a lot of legwork on the phone and certainly the kitchen table approach. And basically, I wanted to briefly show you what our plan quasi looks like. It's a matrix that's actually fairly profound, very large, but it is broken up into 6 objectives. And some of these objectives will be transferable to other watersheds. Some of them will be transferable with just minute changes. It is a good model, I think, and it's worked effectively here. I just took a little slice out of one of our planning objectives, or restore native species and enhance stream habitat, to illustrate to you that what we have here is a number of strategies, and I'm afraid the page couldn't contain all the strategies that the watershed planning team looked at in order to improve aquatic ecosystem health. And within those strategies are a number of actions that actually lead us to the objective. This is a simplified version of our plan. It gets a great deal more detailed, and you'll look across the top row, which yellow row, which is an objective approach, and basically you look across there and it's identifies strategic actions and measures and measurement units and spatial approaches, and all the way over to cost and funding opportunities, as well as some comments. And I think what this does was it doesn't leave a great deal of illusion on how we can improve aquatic ecosystem health and how we can, what we can illustrate the need for sustainable funding for. It gives funding agencies and other participants a comprehensive look at what we need to do, and that they know that we've thought about it and we've engaged a great deal of others in it. Quickly go through this. It's a feedback loop, and basically, you know, in the middle of all this is a funding opportunity. We're going to talk a little bit about our approach, but it's clear to me that it needs to be dedicated, and it needs to be broad-based, and it needs to be participatory, and should include all members in our watershed planning team. So when we start talking about funding, let's move toward a guaranteed implementation strategy. How is it that we are expected to plan, to define what our needs are, to ingratiate ourselves with the knowledge of what the concerns and issues are, and who the players are, and what places the play comes down in? But when it comes down to it, there is no guaranteed implementation strategy. In our plan, we are asked to prioritize project bases but we are not actually led to any avenue to implement or facilitate projects. We know it's going to take lots of volunteer time, and I admire greatly the amount of volunteer time that we as stewards have implemented in terms of trying to play up the cause that we are looking forward to helping. That is improving ecosystem health. There are a number of funding, sort of dedicated funding opportunities that exist here. And certainly the Columbia Basin Trust comes to mind very, very rapidly when we talk about funding opportunities based on the impacts that we received through the Columbia River Treaty. And I could talk on that for a day and a night, but the trust has outlined some opportunities for us to receive help from them in the environmental sector. Certainly the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program, it is compensatory in nature, and so are all of these funding initiatives, I think, without really wanting to say that they are compensatory, that they are compensating for impacts that are general impacts to the place where we live. Certainly the trust in terms of the treaty impacts that have come in our direction, and the Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program, which is a BC Hydro / federal GFO and provincial program looking at hydro dam impacts. And there's an overview that's easily recognized there in terms of those 2 or 3, including BC Hydro funders or potential funders, in that they are about dam impacts. Certainly the most overriding, single most important impact out there for us in the Columbia River Basin is around dams. Of course, we have the feds and the province out there allowing and presenting some opportunities around funding. Regional districts usually have a little bit of effort in terms of funding. Industries there usually upon presenting us with compensatory needs to make up for impacts that they have contributed to ecosystems, but not always. And municipalities are out there, and certainly a broad base of foundations and other funders that are out there that are fairly difficult for us to access here in the Canadian Columbia Basin, basically because they are, we're so small. Whatever it is, 160,000 people that exist in the broad landscape of the Canadian Columbia Basin doesn't even relate to even one small area within Vancouver in terms of political need, but probably does lead to a greater initiative in terms of impact compensation. So, sustainable funding. I guess the approach for us is a user pay kind of approach that has been initiated by the feds, the federal government here some years ago, and undertaken by the provincial government. They led this user pay kind of approach probably a decade and a half ago. But it's based on this little sum up that we have in our grab bag of linguistic prompters. Those that benefit from the environment should be contributing to an ongoing approach to restore it. Restore it. Ongoing. Ongoing is where it's at. And when we talked about funding possibilities, we looked at the CBT, the FWCP, BC Hydro impacts from those funders are ongoing, it's logical that we realize that our sustainable funding approach should be ongoing as well. That's an advocacy approach that we will or will not integrate into our thinking, but perhaps one we should be thinking about. And the other thing is a realization that all of our watershed planning team members have a real strong, unique opportunity to contribute to a sustainable funding approach. Certainly in our sector here, in our area, we have the logging community is stepping up more and more all the time to provide us with materials, provide us with equipment, provide us with small bits of money as they see the kinds of restoration that we are accomplishing here in terms of the 1.3 kilometers of in-stream restoration that we've done. As they see it, they like it, they want to be involved in it, they begin to understand it. So again, that sustainable funding opportunity has to come from everyone who's involved in terms of providing or initiating impacts and initiating benefits from increasing aquatic ecosystem health. For us, it's a sponsorship approach, and there are very many approaches. Terlyn outlined a few approaches that we can take, and donations are an approach that that we've implemented here since '98. The Salmo Watershed Streamkeepers Society has been a charitable society, and it has from time to time received some significant donations that organizations oftentimes would like to receive a charitable receipt for. And certainly it is helpful, but really our major approach to sustainable funding here is a sponsorship approach that translates into bits of money, equipment, materials, and knowledge. So, and I can illustrate, you know, for instance, in the logging community, what we've been able to do is receive large woody debris from logging outfits to contribute to in-stream restoration. They may and have contributed to level logging in terms of monitoring discharge and flow in certain tributaries, and certainly have been allowed us to move ahead with a broad-based temperature monitoring approach. And it goes on and on. I could illustrate this with just about all of our watershed planning team approaches. They like a science-based approach. And they like that we're building this as a scenario that fits into growing cultural mores and values. They like that it's fully inclusive, although there is sometimes some suspicion about that. I think generally what happens is that the watershed planning team wants it, and they like that we are open, and they like that we're honest. So, challenges. These are the big ones. Agencies themselves have no clear environmental strategy. They're caged in motherhood statements. They're broad-based. They have no ability to actually recognized watershed-based approaches or limited ability, and they have no strategic outliers that look to funding watershed-based approach. And I continually recognize that the vagueness in this lack of clarity breeds shifting standards. I have a few illustrations, not just from our group, but from others, where proposals are submitted and they receive some clarity around improving proposals, make those improvements, resubmit, but the standards shift out. It's a difficult problem, and it's based on lack of clarity. Other things are that oftentimes, or at least sometimes, self-validation conflicts with environmental goals. So some organizations are demonstrably more worried about their own self-image than they are in terms of improving aquatic ecosystem health in some strategic, prioritized way. And usually that's comes with some sort of inherent paternalism and perhaps a collection of egos around that paternalism, i.e. the sort of dad approach to how they look at stewardship and other initiatives, not just in the environmental sector, but I'm sure in the social and economic sector as well. And basically what that says and what that indicates is an inability to work in a group. They can't take guidance from groups like a watershed planning team, say, where there is a diversity of interest, that we need to use consensus around, and we need to use consensus, and we need to pull out however a specific group can help. So, and oftentimes they really don't see or understand a cultural stewardship. Their product based is around numbers of grants or something along that line. So they're unable, oftentimes, or haven't really reached the maturity yet to think long term. And this is the kind of gifting that I think that stewardship initiatives, stewardship groups like ours, have to gently bring them to. They have to become inclusive and inherent around long-term thinking and long-term activities, because it isn't just about reaction. And some agencies are not able to distribute resources effectively across the sectors, i.e. when I talk about sectors, I talk about the social initiatives and economic initiatives and environmental balancing approach that I talked about earlier. Sometimes agencies talk about or think about or operate in sectoral silos, and it's really quite difficult. I often imagine, what if we had funding agencies that focused on social initiatives or economic initiatives, but would not grant support to those initiatives unless they had a significant contribution to the environment in some way, shape, or form, whether it be operational or infrastructure. Oftentimes, organizations are reactive instead of proactive. They see things coming, and Carolyn talked a little bit about that. They see things coming, or not, and it doesn't play into their participatory values, but they will definitely react when the time comes. I have some wonderful examples of that here in this watershed. And the ability of respect, which is kind of tied into this corporate personality of being paternal and all that kind of thing, when really they may participate in a watershed team approach or a watershed partnering approach, but they won't take their guidance, and they won't contribute or can't because of their own inflexibility in their approach around granting. So the other thing I want to say about this is that all these challenges imply solutions. So let's go there. I want to talk about groups challenges too. And we all know this, limited time and resources, and often their time is not respected, but only expected. Groups are territorial. We love place and kind of put up this hazy little barrier from outside people oftentimes. I know I'm guilty of it, and you are too. So, and oftentimes it is difficult to capture a replicable approach. If we could agree on an approach to move improvement of aquatic ecosystem health forward, then maybe it would be easier on the collective of granting organization and on the collective of sponsors, industry, and other that are out there supporting these initiatives so that they could move from one area to another. And I know that here in the Upper Basin, some of the players that are on our watershed planning team, for instance, will be on other watershed planning teams. So we have differing mandates. We're scared of offending agencies that often offend easily. That's a big problem. We are often so timid in actually trying to get what we need, even if an agency's mandate itself requires that it listen. We're often scared to speak frankly. So, in this culture of fear has led to stress in working in these partnership approaches. I think it's a real element that people don't want to look at and don't want to talk about, but it is present. And it leads to a decreasing will and ability to articulate uncomfortable management. And really, you know, where we're at is we have to speak frankly and honestly, and we have to honor advocacy and new thinking approaches. Oftentimes our groups have inconsistent knowledge and an inconsistent material base. We don't come on from the same place in terms of our professionalism and our insights and our experience and all that kind of thing. And we're expected to mesh granting mechanisms together that are inconsistent. They have granting mechanisms out there have different start dates, different evaluation criteria, that kind of thing. In terms of solutions, partner. Look for a relatable impact pathway. Certainly with us here in BCTS, the provincial logging outfit, we look at water, easily recognized water quality concerns and discharge concerns, and we speak directly to them how they can help, how they can make changes, and they are actually listening. And I think that's part of it. Be direct, be honest, be forthright, be matter of fact, and involve new thinking as well as old. It's amazing to me how some of the folks that are our elders in this community have been guides to the thinking about how we can move our way forward. And new thinking, around the precautionary principle. I'm so sad that we don't hear that more often in our discussions with industry and funding agencies as well. And certainly accumulated impacts. This is another piece that is generally ignored, and we allow it. And the valuing of natural capital. Be matter of fact. Tell the truth. Increase our will and ability to articulate uncomfortable messages. Go there. It's okay. The other thing is be watershed based. It seems like it's the easiest approach for a large diversity of groups and industry to get a handle on. We've used it here successfully, and I think that with our capacity to illustrate success and to bring in our watershed planning team so that they actually respect what other elements in the watershed planning team are doing and increase their own flexibility to move within that respect package, we will geometrically increase our ability to restore. You know, I think that's it. Anybody left out there?
I just unmuted myself, Gerry, because it's a little odd to be talking with no sound, isn't it? So I was just reading. Thank you very much for that, especially for some of those just sort of advice about how to communicate with prospective partners and agencies. And you know, I do think we need to be clear about what are the impacts we're talking about. But we also need to translate them into ways that other people can understand. I noticed a question here that came a little while ago from Heather Leascheid, and I just wanted to maybe address that a little bit. Heather had asked, how are these concepts, ecosystem services, green infrastructure, and eco asset or natural capital, like how are these similar or different? And I just wanted to address that. I'm going to show my screen. Let's make sure it's the right screen. Gerry, is it the green infrastructure screen that's showing? Yes, okay.
It is, yeah. Or it just left, actually.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, there it is.
So the okay. So there's these three really closely related concepts, and so you're asking me about what are some of the similarities and differences. For me, the similarities and differences in the concepts between green infrastructure, and I'm just going to flip through them: green infrastructure, eco asset, and ecosystem services. For me, they're kind of about what vocabulary is most useful to you in what you're doing. And for me, ecosystem services is the broadest. And so, for example, ecosystem services evaluation, there was a person using that to look at the value of the wetlands in the Columbia Basin, which Kathy Eichenberger briefly mentioned. So this study was done out of SFU. How do we value our wetlands in the Columbia Basin? And what are all the values? And there's a list of types of ecosystem services, provisioning, you know. So ecosystem services, you're mostly talking to, I would say, mostly talking to economists and municipal governments. And when you go to eco asset, when I see what group is using that language, I think it comes out of it's closely related to, you know, natural capital. So you're talking about what's a stock of asset that needs to be protected to ensure a specific income stream. So you're really kind of focused, if you think about just that as a metaphor, and how does it get you to think? It gets you to think more about your stock of capital. It's an asset. So it's still using that same sort of economic framework, but it helps you think about, I think it helps you think about, I think it's a pretty good framework to think about watersheds as an eco asset. I know that's how they're using them in Silverton, in Gibson's, and it allows you to link the asset with some other municipal practice like asset-based management. To a certain extent, these things are really closely related ideas, and so they really work for people like metaphors. They allow people to link ideas together. And so then the green infrastructure one, it seems to me, works best when you're talking with people who provide infrastructure. So this is a very common vocabulary if you're dealing with municipal operations. So because you're really comparing green infrastructure as a concept, so that you're saying we should invest in green infrastructure instead of gray infrastructure. And so you can do your cost comparisons that way. Is it easier for us to pay for treatment, or is it, is it cheaper for us to protect our watershed? So I really think that these are all getting at some of the same fundamental idea, or the same fundamental problem, like how do we really reflect this kind of value in our thinking? And I think that really the difference is like what people use them for, and to an extent that depends who you're talking to. How's that for an answer?
Yeah, that sounds good. I mean, they're basically tools in the toolbox, aren't they?
Yeah.
They allow us to actually, draw those metaphors, and I think that's important.
Okay, a question for you, Gerry. And I know I said I'd let Reagan do this, but she said she was having some trouble with the question. So Reagan, if you want to do the moderator, just jump back in. Question for Gerry. I may have missed it, and this is from Teresa Fresco. May have missed it, but I'm wondering if you have secured funders in your sponsorship for the SWAP actions and objectives.
We have secured partners, some secured partners. So in terms of, I'm not quite sure what secured means, but certainly what we have in place are some long-term partners, and but none of them are money-based folks. Often what we have is a long-term secured partnership in terms of allowing for water quality that's outside the water quality monitoring program. So we have a sampling regime that is hugely, a great deal larger than the water quality monitoring program. That allows us to get some indications around aquatic ecosystem health there, and we have some long-term partners that are moving ahead with allowing us to. They're donating materials in terms of root wads and rock for restoration and storage for those materials as they come available. Also, technology. We have some long-term contributors to technology in terms of level loggers, water level loggers that will make it quite a bit easier for us to determine discharge in some of our main our main tributaries, and also long-term contributors to the temperature logging profile that we have here that's quite broad-based. The other thing is the in-kind support that we have, and that includes not only just labor, but also things like the ability to access software and hardware and programming. That's very important to us in our mapping kinds of approaches. And I think really what we want to say about this is that it is the funding piece, the piece that says money to bring to projects, that is the most difficult for us to access in terms of leading us to aquatic ecosystem health. Those direct line impactors that are out there on the landscape right now are showing that they're very, very willing to, one, understand their impacts, two, reduce their impacts, and three, to look at the opportunity to provide us with tools to overcome those impacts. Don't know if that answers it all, but long answer short, yes, we have long-term funding.
Well, and I think that's one of the interesting things about your approach, Gerry, is that you've been working with these other partners and bringing them to the table, and they do support you with in-kind stuff. I have another question for you, and it's just a sort of a fact question from one of your slides. On the slide where you had, I think, PP for precautionary principle, you also had AI, and Randy Jensen from New Hamel, hi Randy, would like to know what that was.
Oh yeah, I think I spoke a little bit about a cumulative impact. That's AI. not
Oh,
artificial intelligence,
I
but
would have thought artificial intelligence. Yeah.
yeah, but it's a cumulative impact, and I think that that's a grab bag term that we are so ready to ignore, and that we allow um, agencies and governments to ignore, and there really isn't a lot of place for that anymore in the status of our aquatic ecosystem health. That we definitely should be looking at how to value impacts and try to determine where tipping points are going to become prominent in terms of certain species, whether they be flora or fauna. It's a serious concern that is oftentimes overlooked.
I got a couple of comments for us that I just wanted to, in case people aren't watching the question box. One is from Rick Simpson. He says, in the Okanagan, he says, both good presentations. In many ways and at many levels, echo the Watershed Restoration Project management. And he says, spectator training and experiences I've had since 1991. Good coaching and inspiration for groups and individuals undertaking watershed restoration work. The long-term, multi-generational timeline. It's been helpful with the Kettle River Management Plan, and I think he's talking about what he sees in the Coquitlam and watershed and Cowichan watershed implementation. Hopefully, at some level, there's a lot of experience sharing. And yes, that's what we're trying to do with this series, Rick. And then Zita says, in answer to the your comments about cumulative impact, that Zita Patel says the province is developing a cumulative impact framework, and I've seen some record of that in my reading.
Yeah, likewise, I've read that, and you know, uh, it's a bit of a pet peeve, I guess, with me and others in our sector that. Again, it's one of these scenarios where we've been presented with guidelines that approach that teach us to think about watershed planning, for instance, or cumulative impacts. I always make the mistake of calling them accumulative impact, but we have these set of guidelines. The thinking is there for us all. We've got it. We know what's going on, but the planning mechanism, that post-planning guaranteed implementation strategy, both in terms of the legislation, which is constantly lagging behind, but the behavior as well within our own watershed planning team approach. Usually not from the resource sector, but from other sectors, are definitely lagging behind. That post-planning guaranteed implementation strategy is what we all need, and certainly we need to develop some thinking around how to implement that. And we certainly got some suggestions that we're trying to put forward to a number of folks at some point. It would be nice to talk about that in greater length, about how we could put together a set of evaluation techniques and criteria for a program that would support long-term post-planning implementation projects that are prioritized and recognized through consensus by a broad-based watershed planning team. Not that hard to think about once you've got that plan in place, and have seen that it's really difficult to actually move through that plan in some kind of prioritized mechanism that everyone considers necessary.
So I think we have time for one more question, and I wanted to come back to one that Kirsten Harma asked at the very beginning, or pretty close to the beginning, and I just gave her a quick answer initially. So Kirsten used to be the Watershed coordinator, or the Watershed Network coordinator, I think, and she ran away um, from us down to Chehalis, I gather. Hi, Kirsten. So she wanted to know about what examples I could find, or I had find, of quote selling the eco asset concept. And so I mentioned some of the work that I've been seeing on the waterbucket.ca website. And for me, you know, selling or marketing or publicizing these concepts, of course, like any kind of selling or marketing, always depends on your audience. So I think the process of marketing and promoting that concept is happening through conferences. There was a recent one, I think, in Comox, and there's sort of gatherings of the small municipalities that are using that, like Silverton and Gibson's and some others. And so that's when I say they're selling that concept. It's you know, a loose use of the term, building credibility, exploring how it's useful, and seeing what can be achieved by using it as a way to draw people's attention. So that's what I wanted to that's what I probably meant when I said that. So how are we doing? And just another thank you. And I guess I'll take this opportunity to thank both Reagan and Gerry. Thank you both for your presentations today, and I want to thank everybody who was able to attend. I was really pleased to see all you folks listening for this, and hello to all of you, and thank you so much for attending. We will we'll have this recording available and posted on our website probably within a week, and there's a couple of questions about the slides. I haven't checked with Gerry on the slides. Gerry, are you going to make your slides available or just a recording?
Yeah, no, I think I could do that. The other thing I want to do is I want to offer conversation or activity around helping folks, you know, further define ecosystem health and the sponsorship role that we have been able to initiate here. And so anybody wants to talk about this or other issues around watershed stewardship, we're available. And lastly, I want to thank my environmental assistant, Tanya Tron, who is sitting here with us and, you know, helping where she can. She's wonderful. So just like you guys are, Tara. And we will, yeah, we'll see you when we see you.
And a big thank you to you, Tara, for your great presentation.
Thanks, Reagan. Okay, thanks everybody.